This is going to be a follow-up video regarding my last video about Shawn, VenomFangX. I wasn't planning to do a follow-up video, but because of a friend of mine, Anna brought up some valid points in the comments section, I think this video would be necessary just for clarification purposes. So the rest of this video is going to be directed towards Anna. If you're watching this is directed towards your comments. But if you or anyone else has have points similar to what she has, this video is going to be directed towards you as well. Okay, so let's begin. Before we get into the problems I have with Shawn's video, we first need to understand that what Shawn was trying to do here. What Shawn was trying to do, basically, as you correctly pointed out, was that he was trying to show that atheists who hold to naturalism and objective moral truths are being inconsistent and trying to have their cake and eat it too. He was trying to show that atheists like Pat Condell, who express outrage at injustices such as the UK riots, are practically borrowing from the theistic worldview, so that when they cry out injustice around the injustices around the world, they're practically borrowing from the theistic worldview. And which is basically what the argument is. While I do think an argument like that along those lines can be made, and I admit I've used some of those arguments in the past, in Shawn's case, I do not think he did a successful job of that, and I'll explain why in a bit. Before I explain why I felt Shawn's argument wasn't successful, we first need to understand that there's a difference between having a problem with his argument versus having a problem with his overall video. And this is where I think I have to clarify, because I think I gave you the impression I didn't like his video because of the way because of his presentation, when that only played a minor role. Well, no, not minor role. Like played a part in why I didn't like his overall video. So this is just to clarify my reasons for why I didn't like his video. You wrote the following, which I thought made some valid points. You state this: was Shawn's video uploaded at an imprudent time? I think it's fair to say yes, but it would be an error in logic for me to think imprudence renders Shawn's presentation to be logically invalid. The validity or invalidity of his argument and his empathy or lack thereof are distinct issues, and I predict people are going to blur the line between the two. I have reservations about making too big of a deal about his taking advantage of the riots to score points for theistic moral ontology, because what about when Christians cite the Holocaust to do the same? What lay Christian apologist has not cited an example of atrocity or moral chaos to argue that materialistic atheism gives us no reason whatsoever to believe that such atrocities even have moral dimensions? I think Shawn would have done well to have left out the comedic element of his video. However, I do not think that incorporating the London riots or its causes into a presentation of atheism's lack of moral foundation is wrong in of itself. Now, I actually would agree with most of what you said there, but I wasn't arguing that Shawn's argumentation style or him incorporating the London riots was what caused his argument to fail. I was saying his incorporation of it had some impact of his presentation. You're right, it doesn't affect the validity of his argument, because including that in your argument in and of itself isn't wrong. But if we're going to talk about presentation, then I do think it's an important thing to consider. You and I both agree that incorporating the London riots in this video as a support for his argument was made at an inappropriate time. Again, I'm not saying that incorporating that in his argument is in of itself wrong. But if we're talking about presentation, talking about trying to persuade a particular audience, something like that unfortunately has to be taken into consideration. For like the first 4 or 5 minutes of his video, it's basically a parody of himself in a news station, pretending to be some sort of atheist news station, trying to cover the riots, and then cuts back and forth between him and his co-host, where the co-host is shaking a bottle of soda, and going all wild and screaming in order to stimulate a riot. This is a rhetorical trick that's meant to get your attention, and it's obvious the opening is meant to be a parody of how atheists, at least from Shawn's point of view, act out in great injustice. Of course, Shawn completely ignores the fact that this kind of behavior, this kind of rhetoric, doesn't really get them to listen to him, and all it does is just piss people off. It's a bad sign right away. One thing that Shawn needs to keep in mind is that you can have a valid point and a sound argument, but if you present it in a way that's insulting to people, like they're not going to bother listening to what you have to say. Think of it this way. Let's suppose that you're trying to preach the gospel on a street corner. What's going to be more effective? Waving signs around saying turn or burn, or giving out flyers that just simply talk about the gospel itself, doing it in a loving manner? I think the following clip can illustrate my point a little better.
The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Your spirit is dead in trespass and sin. You're an enemy of God. You don't have any hope. You're going to die in your sins and go to hell. Just a matter of time before the death angel comes along.
Now, obviously, I'm not saying that Shawn is going out on street corners and preaching and threatening people with hellfire if they don't convert to Christianity. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that regardless as to whether or not you're right on a specific argument or issue or stance, which Shawn sincerely believes, I believe he's right. He, in his mind, believes he's right. However, if you're being a jerk, if you're making your opposition look ridiculous, people are not going to take you seriously at all. I mean, yeah, maybe you can argue in certain cases, but for most of the time, mocking your opponent the way Shawn did in his video does not get people to take his argument seriously. Even if he's right, it doesn't make people want to take him seriously at all. Now, granted, people are going to reject the truth value of Christianity regardless as to how we present it. That's a given, and I accept that. But even that, you need to tell the truth about the truth value of Christianity with love, with dignity, and respect for people who you disagree with, with people who are going to reject your message. That's not what Shawn did in his video. If you watch the first 4 or 5 minutes of it, it's very obvious that Shawn is not presenting the truth with love at all. Now, of course, granted, that doesn't undermine the validity or of his argument. I agree with you there. But that's just my point is that if he's not presenting the truth with love, most people are not going to take him seriously. Now, if we strip away the really bad attempt at comedy and the window dressing and just look at the nuts and bolts of Shawn's actual argument as presented in his video, I would argue that he makes some very noticeable mistakes. It's very obvious that he's trying to go the C.S. Lewis route here, where he's trying to make the moral argument for God's existence, which in its simplified form is this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Syllogistically, the argument is a valid one, but in terms of soundness, I have doubts about its soundness, but I'm not going to go into that in this video because that would take too long. However, I do give Lewis credit, is that at least in the argument that he presented, he was at least trying to explain how God is the best explanation for for how the existence of objective moral truths imply that the natural world is not all that there is, and that, in Lewis's view at least, the existence of a moral law implies that there's something more than there is to reality. Now, in regards to how Shawn tried to do it, in the description box, this is how he presents his argument. I'll just read it from here. Many atheists are extremely committed to moral absolutes, and to the degree that they are, is the degree that they are not atheists. The atheist reveals his knowledge of God by the way of his conscience when making moral judgments, Romans 1. Since a truly consistent atheist understands that a strictly material world is utterly deterministic, and therefore all human actions and thoughts are a mere chemical inevitability, a true atheist would be content to admit right and wrong do not exist, and not make moral judgments about actions. It would be silly saying a chemical reaction in a test tube is acting morally or immorally, since a chemical reaction obeys the laws of physics. Likewise, if strict materialism and naturalism is true, the human brain is nothing but chemicals acting in accordance with the laws of nature, and therefore its actions and thoughts are not moral issues but just chemical reactions. The obvious problem that Shawn is making here is that he's misunderstanding the very position that he's seeking to critique. For example, in the video, he and his co-host go on about how atheists, or naturalists, as he puts it, believe that we are just animals whose chemicals and atoms just come together. And if I understand his argument correctly, being slaves to our genes, and that there's an inconsistency there. It's one thing to argue inconsistency. It's another to misunderstand the position you're critiquing. Now, in regards to Shawn claiming that atheists believe we're just animals who are just a collection of chemicals and atoms, he is irresponsibly using one of these terms in attacking their argument, and that's one of them. And this is the term. And this is from the dictionary. Animal. Animals are a major group of multicellular eukaryotic organisms of the kingdom Animalia or Metazoa. Their body plan eventually becomes fixed as they develop, although some undergo a process of metamorphosis later in their life. Most animals are motile, meaning they move spontaneously and independently. All animals are also heterotrophs, meaning they ingest other organisms of the products of their subsistence. So according to the scientific definition of the term animal, we would technically be animals too. There's nothing demeaning about the term. It does not take away this. It does not make us the same as, say, a dog or a horse or a cat. And it certainly does not take away our value as we have as God's special creation, or being made in the image of God. Animal is just a scientific name for a multicellular organism, such as dogs, cats, and yes, even humans. Even if we granted for the sake of the argument that evolutionary theory as a whole, which is what Shawn does not believe in at all, even if we grant that as a whole, it does not, whether it be natural selection or common ancestry with other primates, it does not take away any shape or form our status as being made in the image of God. Now, I don't know where you stand on evolutionary theory as a whole, but even if you don't accept it, which is fine, I don't care, the point is that Shawn does not engage what his detractors are actually arguing, nor does he engage in what atheists or naturalists, as he puts it, are using that term to argue a specific point about human nature or about morality. They are not using the same term that Shawn is using. The term. So it's like Shawn is practically speaking a different language from the people he's critiquing, such as the atheists or the naturalists. Again, I understand that Shawn is trying to take the C.S. Lewis route here, but even Lewis himself avoided using this kind of language that Shawn uses here. This is kind of a side note, but I kind of find it ironic that evangelicals who have a similar mindset as Shawn put C.S. Lewis on this huge high pedestal. Yet Lewis himself not only accepted evolution, He also rejected a literal Adam and Eve, and that he had strong sympathies for Catholic doctrines while still being a high church Anglican for the rest of his life. One thing Shawn fails to acknowledge is that one can be an atheist, but not be a naturalist. For example, you can be an atheist and believe in ghosts, or believe in a soul. He is generalizing all atheists throughout this argument. Shawn is basically saying, you're an atheist, therefore you must agree with atheists like Pat Condell or Richard Dawkins. That would be like me telling you and saying, you're a Christian, therefore you must agree with a Christian couple who recently beat their child to death, or agree with the theology of the Westboro Baptist Church. You and I both agree that's ridiculous. If Shawn is going to critique an argument, he needs to make sure he's critiquing the specific argument and not act like all atheists believe the specific argument. That's my point. Another problem I have with Shawn's argument is that he fails to take into account that there are atheists who actually attempted to argue for objective morality apart from God. Whether or not they've been successful at it, that's beside the point. Shawn doesn't even entertain that idea. He just simply goes on to argue that atheists are contradicting themselves without acknowledging that some atheists actually try to argue for objective morality apart from God. A perfect example I can think of is Sam Harris with The Moral Landscape. Now, I'm going to include a description box of an example because I don't want to make this video longer than it should be. So I'll just include an essay that tries to argue for that. Now, of course, you can argue that they're being inconsistent. Now, you can argue that a secular account for objective morality is inconsistent. That's fine. You can argue that. But my point is, Shawn does not even address those kind of arguments, and he just makes hasty generalizations regarding all atheists. This is intellectually absurd. It's intellectually lazy. Now, the next argument that Shawn makes, oh goodness gracious, I'll just play the clip.
And craving for justice, that really shows at the foundational level that, hey, they're not really as atheists as they would like us to believe. There's no such thing as an atheist or an agnostic. They know that there's a God. They're just suppressing the truth and unrighteousness.
And they prove that because they're acquainted with judgments, absolutes, standards, which could never be accounted for in strict materialism.
I really hate it when Christians make this argument. To make the claim that there's no such thing as an atheist or an agnostic is, in my opinion, the equivalent to saying that one was never a true Christian if, for whatever reason, leaves the faith, even if they were devout when they practiced the faith. I would argue this is sort of the mentality of the once saved, always saved doctrine, but that's for a different time. I'm not going to go into it here. For me, one of the main reasons why I don't like that Shawn used this, there's no such thing as an atheist or agnostic argument, is the same reason why I don't like it when Christians use Psalm 14 as an argument against atheism. Not only does it misunderstand the verse in context, when read in proper context it's trying to make, it's also unnecessarily insulting. It does not get the audience to get the audience you're trying to evangelize to. Not everyone is an atheist for the same reasons, or are purposely trying to suppress the truth of God on purpose, when he and his co-host so heavenly imply. Granted, there are atheists who are atheists because they are being stubborn in their unbelief. I grant that. But that isn't the case with all atheists. Some atheists may be lost and don't have all the evidence in front of them. Some maybe are just agnostics who haven't been shown the truth yet. And some just sincerely believe that God does not exist. You have to remember that everyone was created in God's image. With some atheists who might be sincerely seeking God, or some who just simply don't want anything to do with God, or who just haven't been presented with the truth yet. We can't determine everyone's individual case. Even if we granted for the sake of the argument that Romans 1:18-22 is arguing that all atheists are knowingly suppressing the truth about God, that doesn't mean anything when we're trying to get people to agree with your argument, if Bible verses don't mean anything to the atheists. And then Shawn wraps up his argument with this final paragraph. Pat Condell, along with every other atheist on the planet, though he denies the existence of God, reveals his knowledge of God by relying upon purely theistic constructs such as moral judgment, standards, and laws that apply to all humans at all times, which requires a universal, unchanging, and immaterial moral law to hold all humans accountable to. Only a universal, unchanging, immaterial, and moral God could ever possibly account for that. Yet this very same God is the God that atheists relies on making moral judgments, yet denies him in the same breath. Now, this is a conclusion that Shawn is trying to get at. The problem is that in the conclusion itself is not justified. I could simply ask 3 questions for Shawn that shows how Shawn's formulation of the argument is problematic. 1. How are moral judgments, standards, and laws theistic accounts? How are concepts theistic accounts? 2. How do atheists, from Shawn's point of view, crying out for justice, demonstrate that a moral law exists? And if a moral law exists, how does that show that God exists? If God is the standard for morality, then how is it the Christian God as opposed to the Islamic God? If you notice in the video, Shawn makes it very clear that the kind of objective morality can only account for a Christian worldview, and that atheists are standing on the Christian worldview. If you really notice, Shawn quotes Bible verses and makes many statements about atheists and moral absolutes, but he doesn't define what he means by God. He's already presupposing the Christian conception of his argument. Now, please keep in mind, I'm not saying that a version of the moral argument can't be made that is compelling. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the version that Shawn presents in this video is very sloppy. Anyway, I think that's about it. I hope that clarifies where I'm coming from. I'm sorry if the video's long. I'm a little ranty right now, so anyway, even if you don't agree with entirely all of my points, I hope that clears up where I'm coming from. So I think that's about it. Take care. God bless.